In this lesson, we're taking a look at string muting and how you can use it to keep your guitar playing neat and tidy for a more professional sound. This lesson is part of the techniques section of series 3 of my beginner guitar course. You can find the link to the full series in the description below. Now on guitar, without any muting, the unused strings can start to resonate, which can leave you feeling quite unsatisfied with the sound of your playing because you've got this extra messy, muddy noise going on in the background, which you don't hear on records. Now, I've helped a lot of intermediate students fix this problem who've developed sort of bad muting habits, and I've actually had to put a bit of time in myself to maintain it as well. So I definitely think it's worth developing good muting habits from the start, which is what I intend to show you in this video, and then you'll never have that problem. Now that's very much the housekeeping part of string muting, but you can also use it to your advantage to create some kind of extra stylistic effects and new textures in your playing. So I'm going to give you some tips on that at the end of the lesson as well, but the most important thing is the housekeeping for now, so we're going to start with that, so let's take a closer look. So we're going to begin with the fretting hand, and I've given you this kind of extra angled view because I think it showcases it a little bit better. And I want to start with talking about the importance of the first finger with regards to string muting. So if, for example, I want to play the 5th fret of the G string, which sounds like this, the first finger is not only fretting the note, but it's also stopping the other strings around it from ringing out. First of all, if we talk about the strings that are physically below the first finger, so this is going to be the B and high E strings, my first finger, although pressing down on the G string, is just lightly resting on the B string and the E string. So here's the sound if I pick the G string, but then if I pick the B string, you can just hear it's got like a silent, not silent, but like clicky sound. It's not ringing out or resonating or anything like that. And then the top string, the same. So if I strum all 3 strings, the only one you really hear is the G string. So if I accidentally pick one of those top 2 strings, I'm not going to get a horrible note ringing out that I don't want. Now, this first finger also does this job when other fingers are playing. So for example, if I add the 3rd finger on playing the 7th fret of the G string, first finger is still going to be resting on those top 2 strings. So there's 3rd finger doing the fretting, but first finger still lightly touching those top 2 strings, making sure they're muted. First finger can also mute the string physically above it or below it in pitch, which in this case would be the D string. As you can see, I'm still fretting the 5th fret of the G, but the very tip of my finger is just touching the D string enough to dampen it so it's not going to ring out. If I just press on the G string without the finger touching, I can hit the G, but I also might accidentally hit the D and have that one ringing out. Whereas if I just make sure that the tip of my first finger touches that D string ever so slightly, only the G string is going to ring out. And it can also do this when the other fingers are fretting notes as well. But just to give you an example of what else it can do, for example, if I play the 6th fret with my 2nd finger, what my first finger will tend to do is actually just lift up and rest on all the strings around it. So 2nd finger is there fretting the 6th fret, and first finger is just kind of lining up on all the strings like this very lightly, so that none of those strings around the one that I'm fretting are going to ring out. So I can actually strum the top 4 strings here, and thanks to the job that first finger's doing, none of them are ringing out, and it keeps my playing nice and tidy. You just have to make sure that the first finger is very relaxed and very lightly touching the string, because if you press it down too hard, you're going to bar the strings and actually get like, that actually ended up sounding like an okay kind of chord, but it's not what I wanted to hear. Most of the time it'll sound pretty rubbish, and you want to just hear that one single string. And the final point I want to make with regards to the fretting hand is doing a bit of string muting on the lower strings with the other fingers. So for example, if I play that 5th fret G string note again with the first finger, as we've spoke about, first finger is muting the D string and it's also muting the B and high E strings. But that also leaves the bottom 2 strings, the low E and the A string, to ring out. So normally what will happen here is my 2nd and 3rd and sometimes little finger will just rest over the top and dampen those bottom few strings, but you have to make sure there's enough of a curve in all of the fingers so they don't lie down flat and mute all the strings, because then you won't hear the one that you're trying to pick. But they can just rest on those bottom couple of strings, and that means that I can actually strum all the strings here, but only hear the one that I'm fretting. So if you have all of this stuff naturally in place, it's always going to keep your playing extra clean. And likewise, if I'm playing a note with the 3rd finger, my 2nd finger and first finger will just lightly rest on all of the strings behind the note that I'm fretting, and even with little finger, particularly my second finger is doing a lot of the muting here. But yeah, it's just about always having something behind the fingers to keep all the strings nice and muted. I wouldn't say that you need this level of muting all the time. I'm probably overdoing it a little bit, but I just think it's good to show you what's possible. You do need to do it if you're getting to strumming the strings, but only hearing single notes, which is one of the techniques I'm going to talk about at the end of the lesson. But in terms of just your general playing, the more of this natural muting you can get into your playing without thinking about it, the better, because you're just never going to have that problem with all the extra messy noise. Now let's take a look at the pick in hand, and the general rule with the pick in hand is that you want it to rest on the strings physically above, or in terms of pitch, they would be the strings below the one that you're playing. So if I go back to my 5th fret G string example, I can pick the G string and hear that note ringing out, but the palm of my hand underneath, it's really hard to like capture this stuff, but there you can see the palm of my hand is just resting on the bottom few strings. So if I strum those strings in this position, you're not hearing them ringing out at all. Now you've got to be careful that you don't over mute the strings and actually end up muting the one that you're trying to play. So I don't want to kill the G string. I want to make sure that my hand is in just the right position so I can hear the G string ringing out and then not the strings below. And actually, if you're using the trick that I showed you previously, where the tip of your first finger is touching the string physically above, so in this case, the tip of my first finger is just touching the D string there, that means that my right hand only has to rest on the bottom 2 strings. So it gives me a little bit more leeway, it requires a little bit less precision, and reduces the risk of muting the string that I actually want to hear. Now this takes a lot of experimenting and developing muscle memory over a period of time, so it's good to have a couple of exercises so you can practice this. Quite a good one would be the alternate picking exercise that I gave in the last lesson. Worth checking that out if you haven't already. You can also get the tabs on Patreon, but basically what we were doing is using the 1st and 3rd fingers to pick the 5th and 7th frets on each string. So that would be quite good because you get used to where the hand has to sit on to allow for the playing of each string with all the others muted. But you could also use a scale, for example, if you know your pentatonic scale, that would be a good one. So I'm going to start by just playing the scale upwards. And as I move upwards, the right hand is going to creep onto the lower strings. So here I am up at the G string, and then if I just move my hand a little bit and try and strum the bottom strings, you can check that they're all nicely muted under the palm there. And then if I keep going to the top string, my right hand, you can see it's kind of followed the contour of the scale, so it's pretty much resting on all the lower strings now, keeping them all nice and tidy. And then you've also got to get used to, as you descend the scale, the right hand has to move physically upwards to reveal the strings that you're playing, and eventually move off them completely. If I play that top string and I just keep the muting in place, I'm just going to end up picking the strings that are muted underneath my hand. So you've got to get used to the hand moving with the scale and eventually off all the strings. Now when I play the bottom couple of strings, I am still actually resting the palm on the body. You can see it there, just above the bridge pickup. So I still get a reference point and it makes it more comfortable to play and feel a little bit more secure. So I've just got the hand resting on the body when I'm playing the bottom string. And then also when I move to the A string, it's the same because I'm just using the tip of the first finger to keep that bottom string quiet. But then when I move on to the D string, now my first finger is muting the A string in my left hand, and in my right hand I've just moved on to that bottom string. So the bottom 2 strings are nice and muted, so you can only hear the D string, and then it kind of just follows the pattern as you ascend up the scale. So you just get used to that right hand moving with it. This takes a long time to develop, but it's well worth it. I also want to talk a little bit about what to do with the right hand when you're doing string bending. So with regards to the left hand, I talked about that in quite a lot of detail in the string bending video, and I did a little close-up clip of how you can keep the bottom strings quiet when you're bending so that you don't end up bending multiple strings. So check that out if you're having difficulties with that. But in terms of the right hand, when you're bending, if I'm currently bending the 12th fret of the G string, that'll sound like this. And then releasing the bend as well. The problem with this, although I've got the right hand in the correct position and I'm keeping the bottom strings muted like I showed you before, if I do the bend and keep the right hand still, I'm actually just going to bend the string into the position that my right hand is muting the other strings. So that's no good. because it's cutting off the note that I want to hear. So what I have to do is a little tilt with my right hand as the string goes up, and then I can reapply the mute when it goes back down. Now it's really subtle and you might not even be able to see it even on this close-up. If I try and really over-exaggerate it, it's this kind of thing. So you can see the movement of the hand, gets it out the way of the string, and then back down to reapply the mute as the bend gets released. But in actual fact, it's only a tiny movement, just that sort of thing. But that's the way that you go about getting your muting out the way when you're trying to bend a string. So that's the housekeeping stuff out the way. Now let's have a chat about some of the stylistic effects you can create with muting. And the first one is just known as palm muting, which is this kind of more percussive strumming effect. So rather than playing a chord just with no muting at all, like this, if I apply some palm muting, I get this kind of cool, chunky, rhythmic percussive sound. So that's the aim of this technique. Now I'm not really massively fond of the name palm muting, because to me muting is where you stop the strings ringing out altogether, which would sound like this. I would prefer it to be called palm dampening, because you are just kind of dampening the sound of the strings. But it's pretty much universally known as palm muting, so let's just roll with that. And the idea of this is that you want to place the side of the palm of your hand where the strings meet the bridge. Now it can't be completely on the bridge, because that's going to have no effect. The strings are just going to ring out completely, and it can't be completely on the strings, because then we're just stopping them ringing out entirely. It's got to be where the strings meet the bridge, and that way you can still hear the notes ringing out, but the strings can't vibrate fully, so you're just getting this cool dampened sound instead. So if you're underdoing it, you won't get any effect at all. If you're overdoing it, you'll get just no sound out of the strings really. So you're aiming for that Goldilocks area where you're getting that perfect level of palm muting. Now when it comes to this technique, you have to have much more of a perpendicular, kind of right angled hand in comparison to the strings. Normally when you're strumming or picking, you get very much like an angled shape, going kind of diagonally down the strings like this, but with palm muting it has to be flat against the bridge like that. Otherwise you're going to end up with muting some strings more than others. You're going to be over muting the top strings and under muting the bottom strings. So it has to be like a flat shape like this, which isn't quite as natural as diagonal, but it's definitely something you can get used to. Just always be focusing on the sound and making sure that you're not hearing some strings more muted than others. And one final point, you can also use palm muting to play single notes. So if you go back to either the first and third finger exercise from the previous lesson, or just play a scale, you can practice playing the scale up and down by palm muting each note. So that would sound like this. You know, and that'll give you more textures to play with in terms of your lead playing as well. So rather than everything being, you can get this kind of cool, these like kind of funky rhythmic percussive sounds as well. So that's a bit of an introduction to palm muting. And the final thing that I want to talk about in this lesson is strumming single notes. Now this is by far a much more advanced technique than what we've looked at so far, and I would actually probably recommend that beginners don't really try and do this at first until you're pretty comfortable with all the other stuff that we've looked at. But this is essentially this idea of being able to strum all the strings but only hear a single note at once. It's really good for like Hendrixy stuff, for example. You know, adds a lot of flair to that kind of thing. Another great example is the song Can't Stop by Red Hot Chili Peppers, which goes like this. You know, if I play that without the strumming, it's just... it's just lost all its energy. Put the strumming back in. Then you've got the groove of the original track. So how do you actually do this? Well, you've essentially got to combine all the left hand muting techniques that we talked about earlier. Obviously you can't use the right hand to do any muting in this one because it's busy strumming all of the strings, so it's got to be all in the left hand, which makes it really tricky. And sometimes you've got to look at a specific note and go, well, what fingers have I got available that I can possibly use to mute the other strings? And then you've got to practice them and get it into the muscle memory. It takes a long time to develop, which is why I'm not super keen on getting beginners to dive into this sort of stuff straight away, but I do think it's worth being aware of. For example, in the can't stop one, first finger's starting out by playing the A string. So if I want to strum it, the tip of the first finger is muting the bottom string, and then the rest of it is all lying on the top string. So that's pretty conventional given like what we talked about in the start of the lesson. But then when the other notes go on, like higher up in the higher strings, first finger's got to relax and just keep everything else muted. Now obviously you want it to sound a little bit kind of messy and grungy or whatever, because that's part of the style, is that it doesn't sound super pristine. But if you've got loads of open strings and stuff ringing out, it just sounds a little bit too messy and the melody gets lost. So as I say, it takes a lot of practice, but it's just a super cool technique, and I didn't want you to come across it in songs and be like, how is that guy actually doing that? I want you to be aware of it, and then maybe you can start to develop it over time. So I hope this video helps you understand the importance of string muting in your playing and helps you develop some good habits with it. I know it's not the most exciting topic when you're first learning, but it's so important down the line for the quality of your playing, especially if you ever want to get into recording in the future, because when you record yourself, it picks up every nuance and you want to be aiming for that pristine sound that's enjoyable to listen to and doesn't have any kind of extra noise that distracts from the melody. Now obviously there's no need for any guitar tabs or anything with this lesson, but you can get tabs for the rest of the technique lessons in this series, as well as extra materials for the entire beginners course on my Patreon page via the link in the description. You'll also find the link to the series playlist there as well. Remember, all the lessons are nice and organised on my YouTube channel, so feel free to subscribe if you want to follow along, and I'll see you in the next lesson where we're taking a look at how to use a looper pedal, which can be a real game changer for your guitar practice.